Um, there you go, right? A shot at the Postal Service for suppressing this information that she was trying to pass on to other women. By 1914, she's openly advertising birth control devices in her own publication called The Woman Rebel, which is an awesome name for a women's rights activist. In 1916, she establishes a clinic in Brooklyn and begins distributing contraceptive devices to Jewish and Italian women, those who are impoverished. And she is actually in prison for a month for this, right? She's thrown in jail for a month for doing this. So this is like state by state, right? This is a state issue, and so start to see some progress. But again, a lot of this is getting it into the conversation in a more public way. There is a strand of progressivism that we call Native American progressivism, so involved in some of the same reform. Society of American Indians, founded in 1911, seeking to advocate causes, remedy injustice, bringing together Native Americans from various tribal backgrounds. The founder of this society is Carlos Montezuma, who was born in Arizona, actually been captured, sold to a traveling photographer, was captured by a neighboring tribe and sold to a traveling photographer. That photographer brings him to Chicago. He receives an education, goes on to get into medicine, obtains a medical degree, but starts to write about, publish writings where he talks about, in a newsletter, the need to combat the federal government that is too oppressive towards Native Americans, that's dictating too much, that's interfering too much in their lives and in the way that they function and live. And there's too much paternalism on the part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, all of this stuff. At the same time, the other side of the point is saying that their rights need to be acknowledged, right? That they need to be deemed citizens, that they need to have constitutional rights protected, the right to vote needs to be protected, all of this for Native Americans. So you do see some changes, right? Voting rights, for instance, happens during the Progressive era, but really becomes like later on in 1950s and 1960s, Native American activists, political activists, will sort of rediscover Carlos Montezuma and express some of his same ideas and help to make them more popular, right? And try to bring about change. Also, obviously, a critical moment for women's suffrage, the campaign for the right to vote. One thing that happens in the Progressive era is this movement broadens out. It becomes a much larger coalition. It's not sort of just upper class, mostly elite women, more middle class women that are involved, labor unions that are involved in this as well. And so membership in various women's rights suffrage organizations starts to increase, right? Millions of women will join, and others, right? Men who are allies to the cause. And so you start to see some changes that are made here by 1900. Half the states are allowing women to vote in local elections dealing with school issues. I want you to think about, well, why might that be? Why is that sort of a concession that's made? But you also have Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah all adopting full suffrage for women early on, right, around the turn of the century. So Western states. And so there's some debate about what's going on in the West, of why the Western states are the first to grant women the right to vote. So like a more positive, or I don't know, more positive, if positive is the right word, but an interpretation that's sort of sympathetic to the West, I would say, is that the West is just more democratic. There's fewer people, people's voice is important, and people's individual perspectives has a lot of weight, and you have more of a say, and it is more democratic, and that's a function of, you know, what's happening in the West. Fair point. And then you have sort of, I guess, like a more cynical interpretation is, well, this is a way to recruit women to an area when there's not as many women, right, in the West. So trying to get women to come over and settle in these Western states. It's almost like a recruitment tool. And I think, you know, both of these things can be true on some level. 1913, Illinois, the first state east of the Mississippi to allow women to vote in presidential elections. And so it is a state-by-state thing, and they're using the technology of the day. You see like automobile parades. You'll see using like electric billboards and signs and buttons, and they'll march and have advertisements and magazines and newspapers, all pushing for the right to vote. But that's very expensive to do state by state. And sometimes you're not successful. So you spend all this money and resources and you don't get what you're after. So the shift happens where they start to focus on a constitutional amendment. And then obviously that will be passed in 1919, ratified in 1920. So, you know, we just recently this year celebrated the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. So we've been talking about this a while now in this class. We go all the way back to Abigail Adams telling John Adams to remember the ladies. People like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott in the 1840s at Seneca Falls trying to push for the right to vote, make it a part of the conversation. New brand of feminism, new movements that emerge in the 20th century, and then finally this culminates with this breakthrough in 1920. And then obviously this recent election, however you feel about it, happy about the results, disappointed with the results, historic in that you have a woman who is the vice president-elect, right? And Kamala Harris. Again, don't want to get political. Obviously, people have different views of is this happy with the results or disappointed, but no doubt that it is historic, right? And so 100 years after the right to vote is acknowledged in the Constitution at the federal level for women, you have a woman the first to hold that high office. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so the last reform effort that I wanted to talk about today is the conservation movement, the movement to preserve natural landscape, some of the American landscape. And Teddy Roosevelt, president during this era, plays a important role in that. September of 1901, William McKinley, who was president, was assassinated in Buffalo, New York. Vice president was Teddy Roosevelt. So at the age of 42, Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest president, youngest man to ever assume the office of President of the United States. And in my opinion, the most fascinating president, just in terms of interesting as a character in history. Embraced what he called the strenuous life of manly adventure, regarded the presidency as a steward of the public welfare, but just high energy, charismatic person. And I want to show you a clip from a documentary that sort of covers this aspect of Teddy Roosevelt. A little bit of his personality, a little bit of his energy and character.
I wonder how a man so thick-set, of rather abdominal contour, with eyes heavily spectacled, could have so much an air of magic and wild romance about him, could give one so stirring an impression of adventure and chivalry. The Metropolitan Magazine.
Fueled by cup after cup of coffee, served to him in a special mug his eldest son said was as big as a bathtub, Theodore Roosevelt raced through his day. Letters were answered upon receipt, a lifetime total of 150,000, dictated to shifts of weary stenographers.
Jefferson wrote 22,000 letters, and we regard him as one of the great correspondents in American history. Roosevelt wrote at least 150,000 letters. He's the writingest president in American history, by far, and a number of his books are American classics. So he's an intellectual. He read a book a day, sometimes 3 books in a day when he had some leisure. You think of Jefferson as America's Renaissance man, but it's really Roosevelt.
He would not stop talking. He was a one-man gas bag. But it was so interesting that most people didn't mind. One of my favorite stories is that he heard there was a famous big game hunter in Washington. And he said to several people on the staff, "Get that man over here. I'd really like to meet him." So this big strapping English fellow sneaked into the president's office, and the door was closed, and people outside the office heard this talking going on. Finally, the man emerged about an hour and a half later, looking just beat down as though he'd been through a storm. And one of the president's staff said, "What did you tell the president?" He said, "I told him my name."
We love him because of the energy. His laugh was infectious. His son Ted said, "My father had a dozen eggs for breakfast every morning." So he's a large man, and he's larger than life. Roosevelt once said, "There's nothing quite so exhilarating as being thrown over the shoulders of a 300-pound Japanese man." He played all these wild games in the White House. He wrestled with diplomats. He played a game called Single Stick with Leonard Wood, in which they would wrap themselves up in cushions and then beat the living daylights out of each other with sticks until Roosevelt had to stop.
He boxed with a young aide, too, until a blow caused him to lose vision in his left eye. Accordingly, I thought it better to acknowledge that I had become an elderly man and would have to stop boxing, he remembered. I then took up jiu-jitsu for a year or 2. Photographers were forbidden to cover his daily tennis games because he thought voters considered tennis a rich man's pastime. But when a cameraman failed to capture his horse jumping over an obstacle, he was more than happy to make the jump again. "Roosevelt bit me," the editor William Allen White said, "and I went mad."
So Teddy Roosevelt, fascinating, no debate on that front, right? So he applies the same energy to his love of the outdoors. He saw right into hunting and wildlife. And John Muir will also contribute to what he will do as president. So John Muir, a naturalist, Scottish born, spent a lot of time in Yosemite Valley, establishes the Sierra Club, which tried to stop sort of uncontrolled timber companies from unregulated logging and all this, right? Preserving some of, as much as possible of the American forest. This is actually a photograph of Roosevelt and Muir together at Yosemite, and which, by the way, they just go off and camp. At one point, Roosevelt doesn't tell anyone. He has like all these obligations who he's supposed to meet with and appointments, and he just goes off and camps 3 days with John Muir, and people are like furious and so angry that wondering where the president is. He comes back and gives a great speech, and everyone's happy, right? It's just like typical Roosevelt to charm his way out of any situation. And Muir, while they're camping, tells them, "You have to save these places," right? Places like Yosemite, places like Yellowstone Glacier National Park. Now, these are places that Muir is, or places like that Muir is saying, you know, as president, you have to set this land aside, you have to preserve it. Roosevelt doesn't need a lot of convincing, I don't think, but we'll do just that. Millions of acres will designate as protected, will encourage Congress to create new national parks. And this becomes sort of a cornerstone of his presidency and what he seeks to achieve. And certainly one of the important legacies of the progressive era is obviously our national park system, right? And, you know, preaching to the choir, a lot of you who are born and raised in Utah, you know, right? We have 5 national parks in Utah, I believe. And so in your backyard, right? It's sort of the fact that we get to go to these places and you get to take your parents took you, and you can take your children, and they'll take their children, and we as the public get to go and experience and see these places. That's one of the legacies of the progressive era of the conservation movement, people like John Muir, people like Teddy Roosevelt. And I just remember when I moved to Utah, lived here, and then I just drove a couple hours and I went to like Bryce Canyon, and then you go and you see there's people from all over the world, people speaking all sorts of different languages, and just the fact that, I just had to drive like a couple hours and there I was. You sometimes take those things for granted when they're so close to you. So I hope you don't. I just wanted to show you this clip of Park Ranger Shelton Johnson, who is one of the most sought after tour guides and rangers and speakers in all of the national park system. And this is from a documentary where he talks about an experience that he had in Yellowstone. So if I can figure out the best way to do this.
One of the last jobs I had in Yellowstone was delivering the mail on a snowmobile. There I was in the world's first national park, and I remember going down into Hayden Valley. There were bison crossing over the road, 2,000-pound mammals crossing over the road, and it was so cold, it was about 60 below zero. And the bison, as they breathed, their exhalation would seem to crystallize in the air around them. And there were these sheets, these ropey strands of crystals kind of flowing down from their breath. And I saw them, they just moved their heads and were looking at me. And I remember thinking that if I had not been on that machine, I would have thought I had been thrust fully back into the Pleistocene, back into the Ice Age. And I remember just stopping and turning it off, because the only way you could hear is to turn that thing off. And I would turn it off and I would listen. And I felt like this was the first day. And this morning was the first time the sun had ever come up. And the shadows that are being cast right now is the first time those shadows have ever been cast on the earth. And I was all alone, but I felt I was in the presence of everything around me, and I was never alone. It was one of those moments when you get pulled outside of yourself into the environment around you. And I felt like I was just with the breath of the bison as they were exhaling, and as I was exhaling, and they were inhaling, it was all kind of flowing together, and I forgot completely about the mail. All I was thinking of was that a single moment in a place as wild as Yellowstone, or most of the national parks, can last forever.
Okay, so amazing, right? Amazing speaker. Sounds like a terrible mailman. Just have to say it. I just like, Shelton, what took you so long with the mail? Oh, I was watching the bison breathing. You were what? Anyway, seems his calling is not mail, but sharing his passion. So a lot of important legacies from this era. Just, I hope you keep in mind and see connections. I think there's a lot of connections from the Gilded Age and conversations that we're having now politically of wealth. And I want you to think about that, right? Of what are those connections? How are they similar to conversations we're having? And then obviously legacies of the progressive era of these reformers and how that affects where we are now and some of the changes that took place in this time period. So to me, there's a lot we can draw from and a lot of connections I see to the present. And I think that should be an important part of our conversation when we meet this week. So that's it. I'll leave it there, and I'll see you guys soon.